So let's say a little bit about Mao. Mao went to, he studied at OCAD, worked with various different design firms, both in Canada and the United States. Then came back to Toronto and opened Bruce Mao Design, which was for about 20 years he was creative director of. During that time, one of his first commissions was to design a book called, one of the first Zone books. Zone is a press, a publisher, which is started in 1985. So his first creative as his new design firm was in 1985 for Zone. And they tend to publish books on urbanism, on the city, on different kinds of relationships among people in cities or urban spaces. That's how they started as a printer. So we designed the very first Zone book on urbanism, and that included people like John Baldessari, a conceptual artist, or Gilles Deleuze, a philosopher, Peter Eisenman, an architect, Rem Koolhaas, another architect, Paul Virilio, another post-structuralist and contemporary theorist and philosopher. So all of a sudden, Mao is brought into a context with all of these artists, theorists, architects, philosophers, thinking about urbanism. And he argued that was incredibly important for him and formative. So we're going to think about what that might mean as we move forward. Today, Bruce Mao has left Bruce Mao Designs, although that firm still exists. He's currently a faculty member at both the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and Northwestern University. He's been a fellow at Artist in Residence at the California Institute of the Arts, a visiting scholar at the Getty Research Center. So he's really kind of moved from the realm of design per se as in a design firm to working within different kinds of contexts that are more like think tanks. And particularly, he started his own think tank in 2009 called the Massive Change Network, which largely came out of this exhibition. So we'll talk more about the exhibition. So we started Massive Change Network in 2009. It's situated both between Toronto and Chicago at Northwestern University. And it's particularly interested in setting up situations for artists, designers, thinkers, to really use design methodology to, however corny it might sound, create a better future. That's the idea. One could argue whether it does that, but that's the idea. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the exhibition. So you can see again one slide here. My apologies for the other slide on the left. And then here is the catalog that went with it, the Massive Change catalog, which was, you can see it's written by Bruce Mao and another entity called the Institute Without Boundaries. That's another think tank that Mao established, and which started on basically this 43-point program he organized around called the Incomplete Manifesto for Growth. And that particular text was really trying to be a little bit more strategic about the ways in which the design process or design methodology can be utilized in relation to contemporary social and political problems. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the exhibition. The Massive Change exhibition, again, for which this was the catalog, was really started as a way in which to think about the following themes: urbanism, information technology, transformation, energy, markets, the military, materials, manufacturing, wealth, and politics. So there was, and it doesn't really matter if you've gotten all of those, but there's these big, broad themes, which you can see from this list, situates itself around everything from information around cities, technology transformation, communication and transportation, as well as bringing it back to things like manufacturing, corporate capitalism, markets, etc. In this exhibition, there are all sorts of materials explored and thought through. Talked a lot about waste and sustainability. So for instance, there's one room that was made completely out of garbage, the entire walls and material within the room. And the whole room was really thinking about waste and the ways in which waste has become an issue around, a big global issue or concern. At the same time, they had other kinds of exhibitions, the one that I just showed with the cars there, which were mostly cars driven either through human capacity, some of them were even driven by foot power, but also by alternative energy sources. A third thing that this exhibition had was a lot of new kind of speculative or transformative design. Transformative design is often a word that we use that connects back to notions of design that's not just about a product, answering an issue around a product or a kind of marketing method, but rather thinking about how design itself, better design, more intellectual and sustainable design, can change the social world. So it can move out of the object and instead engage with broader questions again around social and political needs. How can it change society? So included in that different transformation design elements within the exhibition were things like genetically modified featherless chicken. Right? What would it mean for this chicken now, who's a featherless, so it can survive in warmer climates, to be to deal with issues around hunger or poverty around the world. I think that featherless chicken, that became a kind of big emblem of the show. You know, I think one thing that maybe is a little bit clear in this image on the right, but even this particular room of the exhibition is tame. There's a lot of information that goes with the show, a lot of didactic, textual information that you are meant to read. And so that one element of that featherless chicken, which has been genetically modified, within the exhibition there was no real discussion of what that means ethically, right? What does genetic modification really mean? Instead it was just situated around issues around sustainability and world poverty and hunger. And so there's a lot of criticism of the Massive Change show that there were not enough voices in articulating or arguing for what that change should be. Right? In other words, what kind of change should we be arguing for? So I think that that's rather, that's kind of an interesting point and an interesting criticism of the show. There's one more image of the exhibition that I want to show you here, and this is the image gallery. They had a couple of rooms like this, these massive image galleries where images were on all over the walls, all over the floor, ceiling, as well as the furniture that you could sit on. A lot of these images were on technology, so everything from sonogram images to telescopic or microscopic imagery in this particular room. And the ways in which those images, I mean, it was really trying to get the viewer to think a little bit about how those images might trigger an awareness or understanding, even discussion of the ways in which we, the individual, connects to a much broader world that sometimes we can't even see or imagine without this technology or imagery. So the Massive Change show was incredibly complex in the kinds of ways or platforms it put together to discuss or at least started discussions of some of these difficult social or contextual issues. But here's where I want to really bring it back to what we're going to talk about in today's class. And we're going to start today's class with a designer. We're going to end today's class with not really with a designer, but with an artist who explores graphic design in a different kind of way. So we'll kind of tie it together in that way. But really why I was connecting this show with what we're going to do next is because of the topic of today's class, and that's the public sphere. And I want to be really clear, it's also, I think, one of your keywords for today's class. but to be really clear we understand what that is. Because we're going to move back in a moment to mid-19th century Paris. And we're going to think about how the public sphere was articulated there. But it's the same kind of public sphere we have going on within this exhibition. And within all of that broad social change that Mao is arguing for, through the exhibition itself, through the catalog, and through the various think tanks that he establishes, he's really trying to set up these kinds of opportunities for a public sphere. So let's get on with the definition. Public sphere is really an area of social life where individuals can come together to freely discuss and identify societal problems. So again, an area of social life where individuals can come together to really freely discuss and identify broader social problems. But it doesn't stop there. The idea is that through that discussion, you can actually influence political action. So again, it goes back to this notion of change. Something can happen by bringing people together and allowing for that free discussion and debate around these big problems. The theorist that I'm going to connect with the public sphere is a German theorist by the name of Jürgen Habermas. I'll spell his last name for you. Habermas. Habermas is one of the central theorists on the public sphere. To a large degree, he was writing in the early 20th century, although we date the public sphere back to the beginnings of capitalism and to shifting public systems or shifting political systems towards republic and democracies. But Habermas was one of the first real central theorists on the public sphere, and he defined it in a couple ways. First of all, it's public, right? It's open to everyone, open to all, equally accessible. Although obviously at different historical moments, we have societal values that might prohibit that. So in other words, the public sphere in the mid-19th century was not as available to women as it was to men. It was still available, but in different ways. So, so even though it's open to all, there may be some prescriptions that a society holds. And it's defined by Habermas as basically a society that's engaged in critical public debate. So again, critical public debate. Its qualities may include things like, again, all citizens have access to it, that these citizens can come together in an unrestricted fashion, and that this group can discuss matters of general interest, right, that affect everyone. It's not a platform for an individual to promote individual desires or needs, but rather to think about those needs in connection to a broader debate around a society or a public. No public sphere. Actually, Arvind, I want to go back to that notion of change. So we're talking about the conditions of the public comes together, the ability to discuss and debate. But here, I want to say that it really is about that notion of transformation. So it's not just about the debate, it's about thinking about the ways in which that debate plays back or influences broader political action. And one could even argue that within a democracy or a republic, a government's laws or its policies should be, in some ways, steered by the public sphere. I mean, that's how participatory democracy works. That's how any kind of political system based on representation of a people works, right? That you have, it's not only that you just put your faith in these politicians, but that you actually elect them or put your faith in them because they are representing you and representing your needs and your ideas. But how do those needs and ideas get negotiated? Again, that's through a public sphere. In a sense, in here I want to think about, we're going to come back to the notion of the public sphere in a little while when we discuss another one of your keywords, discourse. So I'd ask you to keep this slide in mind until we come back to that. But I do want you to really be aware that the public sphere develops hand in hand, at least for the purposes of our class, or might even be argued to be an underpinning or condition of what we're going to define as modernism in this class. So today's the first class where we're going to so full on be thinking about the notion of modernism. And we went from one keyword to another, so here's modernism for you. And then we'll get going. But maybe a good slide to think about. So in other words, just to finish up on the Habermas idea of the public sphere, we can think about Mao's massive change exhibition, all these people in a room, as being a kind of venue for the public sphere, right? The public sphere can happen in multiple ways in various places. It can happen in public demonstrations or collective engagements of people in various ways. Like it can even happen at a coffee shop where a group of people get together to talk about something. It can happen in an exhibition, particularly an exhibition like this that's all about transformative design, how design is going to solve the problems of the world, right? Eradicate poverty, help us deal with issues around sustainability. So really this idea of the public sphere is that it can happen anywhere. It's just, again, based on the notion that everybody has access to it, and everybody can, within that, it's societal problems or broader social or communal issues that get discussed. So again, it can happen in a space like this. But now let's move to modernism. And I thought, since we're going to talk about Paris, we can look at the Eiffel Tower as a symbol of modernism, which was completed in 1889. Today's class credits basically hover between the 1860s and the 1880s or so, early 1890s. And when I think about that term, modernism, so let's start with its root, modern, present, up to date. Something which distinguishes itself from the past, right? Something new or innovative. If that's the word modern, and now we're going to think about modernism as a historical period that is largely defined by that term modern, new, up to date, some kind of break with the past. But as a historical period, what we determine or call modernism is a time frame which really begins in the 19th century. Historians debate about exactly where, but for the purposes of our class, we'll say mid-19th century. And ends right around the 1960s, or in the mid-20th century. Now again, scholars debate whether it started a little earlier, whether it ends a little later. We'll just think about it for our class within that 100-year period. And in a sense, it ends because of something which we've talked about already in this class, postmodernism. And even there we have historians and philosophers arguing whether modernism really stopped, or whether our contemporary world, whether postmodernism itself is just a reworking of some of the values of modernism, but still promoting those ideas. Modernism is a historical period, again, lasting from the mid-19th to the mid-20th century, is a moment with its roots in Enlightenment thought. So I want to go back to the Enlightenment. Remember, we thought about things like progress, a belief in reason, the whole death of God phenomena. All of that happens within modernism too, and is in part some of its underpinnings, a real emphasis on Enlightenment values and critical self-reflexive thought. Back to that in a minute. Modernism is also a historical period in which the kind of wide-scale and far-reaching industrial transformations of Western society are mitigated and understood. So in other words, we've talked about the Industrial Revolution and we tied that to 1851 and the Great Exhibition at the Crystal Palace. Remember that from your midterm? But here's where we really start to think about what does that mean? How does that technology, that communication material, that transformation in terms of transportation or bringing people together, how is that really thought about or understood? So modernism looks at or thinks about processes of modernity. And by modernity, I mean those things that make us modern, right? Those cars, those planes, those transformative technologies. And modernism is, in a sense, a way to make sense of it, negotiate it, and think about it. Now here's where I want to bring it back to notions of art. And because we can also think about modernism not just as a historical movement or philosophical movement, but also an art movement. And by that I mean, we're going to look at a lot of different kind of works in the next couple weeks that are all loosely called modernist. But central to any modernist cultural production is that notion of breaking with the past, somehow transforming. So it's the belief that traditional notions or forms of art, so traditional art, architecture, literature, were really outdated within that new economic and political environment. And so modernism in the arts tends to embrace the new, but it can be in very many different ways. So in other words, it might be a new technology or a new material that an artist is exploring, or it might be a new subject matter that an artist or designer might be exploring, or it might be a traditional or historical subject matter, but its treatment may be totally different. So when we talk about modernism in relation to arts and culture, there's no one way it looks or in which it's taken up. So just kind of bear that in mind as we move through. There's a really notable characteristic of modernism that I want you guys to keep in mind. It's something that we actually even practice, or at least the hope is that we're practicing that in this class. And that characteristic of modernism is self-critical thought. Right? We don't just take truth that we're told and believe it. We reflect on it. We critically think about it. And we engage with a kind of process whereby we investigate or examine those claims, those thoughts, those traditional forms. So in this sense, that self-reflexive or self-conscious thought really is a tool that's part of modernism that helps it more readily embrace the new. It helps it understand the difference between contemporary society at that time and historical society. And so we're going to think about what that means and as we move forward. Let's just talk a little bit about the Eiffel Tower. You guys have probably seen it before. The Iron Lady in France, it's an iron lattice tower, which is located in at central Paris. When it was built in 1889, it was the tallest structure in the world. It's even today the most visited paid tourist monument in the world. It was named after its designer, Gustave Eiffel. But this is what I think is interesting to think about. It was built, and Eiffel also built the internal structure of the Statue of Liberty, which is kind of interesting. But it was built, he's an engineer, it was built as the entrance to the 1889 World's Fair in Paris. So this brings us back to World's Fair and exhibitions and display that we talked about in the first part of time. So remember we talked about the World's Fair as being a place to showcase one's technology, to put one's nationalistic foot forward and demonstrate its prowess, a country's prowess. Well, certainly that was done with the Eiffel Tower. It was about demonstrating the engineering capacities of France.
What year was the World Fair, you said?
So 1889.
1889.
Mm-hmm. So, and that was an important World's Fair for Paris, because does anybody remember 1789? What's 1789?
French Revolution.
French Revolution, thank you very much. 100 years, the centennial after the French Revolution. So it became a place where France really think about itself 100 years later. And this was quite a monument. I mean, it's made with 18,000 different pieces of iron joined together by 300 workers. It's an open lattice structure. There was a lot of danger being undertaken by the workers putting this up, right? You're not the modern safety conventions that we might have today. Interestingly, only one worker died in the production of the monument, but still. But what's even more interesting is it galvanized the arts and culture community of Paris. There were those who saw this monument as fantastic, right? That it was demonstrating France's embrace of modernity. Others who argued it was a piece of junk, literally. So 47 artists, writers banded together and called themselves the self-proclaimed defenders of the city's culture. And they wrote a whole series of publicity articles and almost a manifesto of sorts, which was published in a daily newspaper, to talk about why this was a horrible monument. They called the proposed tower a belfry skeleton, a quote, truly tragic street lamp, quote, a half-built factory pipe, a carcass waiting to be fleshed out with freestone or brick, a funnel-shaped grill, a hole-ridden suppository, a mass of iron gymnastic apparatus, incomplete, confused, deformed, unquote. So it gives you a sense of, and those were artists, writers, cutting-edge thinkers invested in that. So when we talk about modernity, a lot of the work that I'm going to show you in the next few weeks you've probably seen before. It's not that far removed from our own cultural history. But in its moment, most of it was contradictory, conflictual, contested, disturbing to its public, meant to really kind of inflame or in some ways question, sorry, another slide I've been building up, question the public, force the public to rethink its values or the terms of its values. So I'm going to try to keep that notion of the Eiffel Tower and that notion of a conflicted history around modernity or modernism in mind as we move forward. And just to give you, I don't think I told you the height of the structure, that it's basically 1,000 feet tall or 324 meters tall, 1,063 feet. The same height as basically an 81-story building. Pretty tall. Okay, any questions about modernism or the public sphere before we start talking about some other work? Okay, great. Then we're going to start with probably an oldie but a goodie. I don't think I can teach modernism without Manet's Olympia. And so in today's class, we're going to talk about modernism in relation to the arts in two ways, in relation to art and design in a couple different ways, but two that I want to point out right away. One is subject matter, one's technique. So new kinds of subject matter, new kinds of technique. What I'm going to show you Manet's Olympia next to Titian's Venus of Urbino, and you quickly realize it's not a new subject matter. So we're going to start with talking, although it's treated very differently. So sometimes the distinctions or the differences of how subject matter or technique can work and demonstrate that issue of modernity might be rather complicated. But I just wanted you to keep in mind, I can't remember if we looked at Titian's Venus of Urbino in this class, did we? No, okay, well, that was a mistake on our part. Anyway, look, it doesn't really matter, other than to show you that a painting painted in the mid-16th century was the model for Manet's own Olympia, painted 300 years later. And I think that that's interesting when you think about it. I'll go back to the main slide. What's at stake for him? Here's an artist who knows his past, right? Knows what he's interested in painting, but he's doing it in a way that's definitely going to arouse feathers. And so let's think about what that means. First, let's start with subject matter. While this may be a traditional historical subject matter, the female nude in art goes all the way back to the ancient Greek period, so it's nothing new that we haven't seen before. But Manet's treatment of it is totally different. And so when we talk about subject matter in relation to modern art or modernism, we want to think about how modern artists or designers are connecting to issues of modernity. What I mean by that is, how are they connecting to those social and cultural changes that are happening all around them because of a world that's been fundamentally altered by science, technology, urbanization, industrialization. So in a sense, these artists are responding to that. So a more traditional mid-19th century or late 19th century even subject matter, we'll see plenty of these in a few minutes, are things like railway stations, crowded bars, streets crowded full of people, steam engines, etc. So we're going to see those sites of modernity even more clearly articulated as we move forward. But in this image, Manet is showing us something different in relation to subject matter. It may be your same old standard female nude as a genre, but he's treating that female nude very differently. And in the process of that, he's demonstrating that within modernism, there's different relations being called up between genders, right? Same image, but it needs to be treated differently. So let's think about what that may mean. Let me tell you a little bit about the image, and then we're going to look at that comparison with the Titian painting. Olympia was painted by the artist Edouard Manet. Manet here, M-A, not M-O. We're going to look at Monet in a minute. And Manet was an artist who was a well-known artist, even when he painted this image, but known for being somewhat controversial. So he painted this work in 1863, but he actually only showed it to his friends in his studio for 2 years. He first displays it to a public at the annual Salon in 1865. And I think that's significant. We'll get back to that in a minute. The title alludes to a novel from around the same time period, a few years earlier, a very popular novel called Olympe, or again calling up that notion of Olympia, in which the writer, Alexandre Dumas, so D-U-M-A-S, wrote about an ambitious prostitute who was trying to social climb, right? Use her sexual position to kind of climb up in society. So even at the time that it was painted, Manet, whether this was intentional or not, my money would be that it was intentional, but this painting was compared to the main character of Dumas' story. When it was displayed, critics had a lot to say about it. In fact, most people did. Again, going back to that notion of a kind of public sphere and people talking about work, let's think back to those images of the salon, where you'd have hundreds of paintings on the wall and people talking about it in the center. Those people in the center were then some of which critics going to write about it in the daily newspapers and magazines. And this is how the critics talked about this painting. Quote, "What is this odalisque with a yellow stomach? A base model picked up, I know not where, who represents Olympia. A courtesan, no doubt," unquote. Another critic, quote, "A courtesan with dirty hands and wrinkled feet. Her body has the livid tint of a cadaver displayed in the morgue," unquote. And those were the nice ones. This painting was written about after the Salon intensely, and there's about 100 different mentions of this work in critical press, of which only, I think, 5 said anything nice about the painting. So you can see it was pretty revolutionary and confrontational. And let's think a little bit about why. And here I want to go back to subject matter and technique, and we'll come back to that a couple times. We'll start with subject matter first. And here I'm going to just show you the difference between these two images again. Was it uncommon for Manet to use a historical model to paint in relation to? So he was interested in thinking about his relationship to past artists, to his context. He mirrors a painting done by Titian, a painting, again, of a female nude, although this time she's called Venus. right? The goddess of love. We've seen that before, that notion that we paint a female nude, call her Venus. Remember Aphrodite of Knidos, right? We, all the way back in ancient Greek art. This idea that we call her a Venus to justify or legitimize the genre of the female nude. The woman on the right is similarly presented. She's staring straight out at the viewer. So same kind of representation in the subject, or same kind of situating the subject. In the right-hand corner in the back of the image, we have two servants who appear to be, one's kneeling down, one's standing. They're actually putting clothes in a marriage chest, a cassione, they're called, this kind of big chest. So the idea was that this is an image, maybe it's a Venus, but it's also calling up notions of marriage, ideas of, and in fact it was given as a wedding gift from a woman to her fiancé. So it has this kind of quality. You'll notice there's a sleeping dog here, long as symbol of fidelity in art. We saw that with the Arnolfini wedding portrait by Jan van Eyck. So, and then let's think about the figures. Again, just do a little comparison of the two figures. They're positioned the same way. Those are the attributes of Titian's Venus, but let's look at the attributes of Olympia. Instead of having that recessional space here, we have that space taken up by a maid who's bringing her flowers, right, a bouquet of flowers. One would assume to a male admirer. It's really hard to see in this image, maybe you'll see it a little bit better when we go back, but there's a little pet here as well. It's not a dog, it's a cat, and that cat has an arched back. It's really hard to see this slide. You'll see it better if you look online for it, online on the images that I post. But other than that, the figures are kind of positioned similarly, but there are some distinctions. So look at the difference in the way in which they're looking out at the viewer. And let's go back to that notion of the gaze that we talked about in this class, the keyword of the gaze. Titian's Venus is looking out at the viewer rather coquettishly, right, alluringly. There's a sexual overtone. You look at her body language, it's a bit more passive. You look at the trajectory of her left arm, it leads you down to her sexual areas, to her vagina. Now let's look at Olympia. Olympia is staring out at the viewer much more directly. Her left arm also leads you down to that area of her body. But this time the hand is clamped down. It's not a passive hand, it's one quite active. And one which is, in a sense, provoking or like her view, challenging the public a little bit more directly. That's why people at the day called this a prostitute, right? Saw her as a prostitute. It doesn't matter that the model for Titian's Venus of Milo was also a prostitute, right? But in the history of art, it was very unusual for a woman to take off her clothes for a male artist prior to the 19th century without that probably being their social reality. Right? Because women, just respectable women of a higher class, wouldn't have done that. So here we have two figures who were both probably prostitutes, courtesans, represented very differently. In relation to subject matter, what the public found so controversial about the Manet was that directness, was the way in which he was staring out at the viewer. She was staring out at the viewer, provoking the viewer. And for many, that called up that social phenomenon of prostitution, which was incredibly complex debate, discussion, discourse in the public sphere at the time. And so thinking about that, just to give you a little history, mid-century Paris showed an enormous rise in prostitution as a practice. It was legal, although beginning in about 1860, women had to women who participated had to submit to the state for, I think, monthly health exams. That wasn't because anybody was too concerned about the women, mind you. It's because they were concerned about something else, and that was the spread of sexually transmitted diseases, including syphilis. Manet himself died from syphilis. And that's because the bourgeois, middle-class, male public participated in the practice of prostitution so much that there was fears about the way in which prostitution was affecting the bourgeois family and how that family values and a society built on family might be impacted. So questions of what prostitution did to traditional notions of family, to relationships between genders, and even notions of capitalism. What does it mean to sell the body in that way? Were being discussed. And that's why it's that context, that historical context around prostitution, around mid-century Paris, that made the subject matter of this image so controversial. The problem is, Olympia doesn't lie down like your regular female nude in art, right? That's what's at stake. She doesn't make it easy to look at her. She instead asks us to think about these broader issues. And now I want to think a little bit about the second issue that I'm going to talk about, and that's technique. And we'll come back to this as we move through. I just want to make sure you have these two ideas firmly situated in your head. And when we think about technique, look at how this is painted. For the first time, we can so clearly see brush strokes, that there's no attempt to make them interlocking or perfectly situated in relation to one another. There's a move away from the illusionism of the painting, right? It doesn't have to be so illusionistic, so representational. This is not some window into another world or mirror of a reality. Instead, it's a painting, and you're meant to see it as a painting. So for we see the artist breaking down brush strokes. Gesture becomes much more evident. And that, for critics, is really hard to see. They see that as an unfinished painting. And if this looks pretty finished, by the end of today's class, we'll look at some stuff that's really scrappy, very broken apart brushworks that looks much more like a sketch, but is a finished work of art. I should have said, I didn't even say, we're looking at, in today's class, we're looking at a lot of artists that are associated around a term known as French Impressionism. I'll get to that term a little bit later, but maybe you guys have heard of that or have seen some paintings. And I just want to say, I always think it's interesting, anytime a museum's having a little bit of financial issues, like big blockbuster museums, the first thing they do is schedule an Impressionist show. Why? Because the public loves it. Right, you can pack them in. In fact, about 6 or 7 years ago in Boston, there was a show of at Boston Museum of Fine Art, a very big, very prestigious institutional museum. They had a John Singer Sargent show. Boston-based Impressionist painter, moved to Paris for many of his years around this time, sent his painting back to the United States to sell. The show was so popular. I mean, think about this at the back. The show is so popular, they opened it 24 hours a day. So people went, in fact, I had tickets to see that show at like 3 in the morning, and I know it's so nerdy that I actually went. But that idea that, it's popular work, that people love it today. You see posters, t-shirts, coffee mugs with Impressionist paintings on it. The reality in its day, people weren't so enamored of it. Some people were, some people weren't. In its day, at the end of the 19th century, an artist we're going to look at in a minute bequeathed his Impressionist collection to the French state. You know what the French state did? I don't think so, guys. Thanks anyway. We'll take a couple paintings maybe, but we're going to sell the rest off. That's why we have fantastic Impressionist work in North America, because North American collectors went over there and bought it. So this notion of Impressionism as being like easy and light and happy and playful, in its day, it was controversial, pissed critics off, made people angry, resulted in lots of debates and firestorms, controversies around art production and culture. And it's really hard to kind of remember that when we just look at pretty little water lilies or other things. So in today's class, I really want to try to remember that this stuff was seen by critics of the day as a big, literally, F you to art historical traditions, to the salon. It was seen as a waving, as artists saying in a really clear way, we don't want to be part of traditional values anymore. It's just hard for us in our, early 21st century to remember that when we look at it. So we'll come back to that. Okay. So we're going to go through a couple artists as we move forward. I'm just going to get a little basis around this term impressionism. But to do that, I want to show you one more image by Manet, totally selfishly, because it's my favorite image by Manet. So, and if I showed you Olympia, one of his first images that was so controversially received, I'm now showing you one of his last images. This is a work that he produces right before he dies, and which was still quite controversial in its day, and was openly debated around the meaning of the work. In fact, it still is. I can't remember the historian's name who edited a collection of essays, but there's a book called The 12 Views of Manet's Bar, and it refers to this image, a view at the bar at the Folies Bergère. Any of you guys ever seen the movie Moulin Rouge? Right, so and we're going to look at some images in the Moulin Rouge in a little while. The Moulin Rouge is like the Folies Bergère. It's a nightclubby kind of bar that you would go to and get, you would have drinks. You would not only you would see nightclub performances, and in fact, it's really hard to see in this image, but you'll notice something up here. Anybody tell what that is? It's the feet of a trapeze artist, because there was a trapeze artist who would perform at the Folies Bergère, right? So we just see her feet and the pole there that she's on top of. But let's think a little bit about what Manet shows us in the painting, and I want to go back to that two notions: subject matter and technique. Modern art tends to be, tends to show itself in relation to those two things. Subject matter, a bar. Right? We haven't seen too many images of bars prior to this period. Right? Why? Because the modernization of Paris, which we're going to talk about in a little more as we move forward, creates these kind of venues or opportunities for people to get together in social ways. It gets complicated how and why that happens. We'll kind of come to this. But it's really the birth of what we know as leisure, which we're pretty used to that term today. But prior to real industrialization and urbanization, people didn't really have a 9-to-5 work week, right? People worked all the time, or they worked when they needed to work. The standardization of a working day into 8 hours, and what we know today, but it wasn't 8 hours at this time, but that notion of breaking the day up, breaking the week up into days when you work and days that you have off, is actually the construction of leisure, and it's a relatively modern phenomenon. And if you have leisure, you need to have, or you prioritize between working and not working. You have to have things to do when you don't work. So we have the kind of spectacle culture of a modern city situated in relation to this time period, right? Now all of a sudden you can go to theater performances. It's not just for the elite. You can go to bars and to social venues where the genders and the classes might mix together. So Paris allowed for the modernization of Paris in the mid-20th century, which again, mid-19th century, which again we're going to come back to, was very much about that notion of the of these sites of leisure and how they might allow for, again, these bringing together of different genders and of different socioeconomic class strata. So let's think about that here for Manet's bar. And just like with Olympia, Manet pushes the most important parts of the composition all the way forward in the picture plane, right? Like with Olympia, we don't have to look in a recessional space here. The barmaid is up front and center, right, looking at us. So we see her situated here in a bar. We see glasses, a bowl of fruit, some different bottles of alcohol, and then we see what appears to be a mirror behind her, right? We can see the frame of that mirror here, as if she's projecting what's in front of her. And then on the right over here, we see the back of that figure and her male client, who she's serving, who I guess is a stand-in for us. Already, Manet has skewed our perspective, right? We would imagine that reflection to be right behind the figure, since she's faced towards us, but it's skewed off to the side, creating a little bit of a straight. I mean, sometimes Manet didn't understand that. He chose to paint it that way, right? the writer's student once who said that, well, maybe that, she raised her hand, it was really quite nice that she felt comfortable saying it, but saying, maybe Manet didn't know how to paint that, right? But no, he knew how to paint, he'd been painting for a long time, he chose not to. Why? Then let's think about this reflection in the mirror. Here we can see the table of the bar, right? We can see that here as well. But you'll notice that the bottles are not exactly what we see here, right? So there's a little bit of skewing going on. You can see, so you can't see it this side, but you can see some reflection of bottles over here too, but again, it's not the same ones. Now let's think about if this was really a bar and we were the patrons standing in front of it, and that was a mirror behind her, where would we be standing? In other words, that mirror shows a kind of floating table with it's a two-tiered bar, right? So there's people down here, and then this is a balcony with people over here, and the trapeze above. So if that were the case, what would we be standing on, right? We'd be kind of floating there in mid-space. As I said, historians long debate the meaning of this image, but one could argue that he's not only showing us a contemporary subject matter, a bar, but he's showing us what it's like to be in that bar, right? When you're slightly buzzed, or you're slightly confused because there's so much going on around you, or you're letting go of any kind of need to be completely cognizant or rational, and you're just having a good time with all the cacophony of sights and sounds around you. So for Manet, here he's playing with subject matter as well, right? By showing us not just what you see in a bar, but what you might feel being in a bar. And we haven't seen artists do that yet, right? Where they really allow for a space in the work for the artist's own subjective vision, right? The artist's feelings about their subject. I shouldn't say we haven't seen that before. We haven't seen it so dramatically before. We'll get to why that might be a little later in our class. So we're going to talk about dealers and critics and kind of open market, art market as we move forward. But I think that's significant to even note here. Okay, so that's the subject, right? It's complicated. But now let's look at how it's painted. And again, the fuzziness of the composition, the move away from interlocking brush strokes, from clear illusionism, we're letting go of that. Right now, think about the smokiness of this, the smokiness up here. So very, the brush strokes are really pulled apart. It's very, impressionistic, to use an overused term in relation to impressionists. But we'll get to why that is. But it's again that move away from caring that it looks finished or that it looks exactly realistic. And if you think it's starting in somebody like Manet, it's really evident in somebody like Monet. And so here I want to think about that a little bit more and get into that technique and thinking about shifts in technique. And as you look at Claude Monet's Impression Sunrise from 1872, you'll note that here we have just short, choppy brush strokes, juxtapositions of bright colors, no blending going on. Colors like laid beside each other as opposed to blended. The idea of a modern subject matter here is one that's very fleeting, very ephemeral. It's changing before our eyes, as if he is trying to capture for us quite distinctly that notion of the of something changing, atmospheric conditions changing. Now, in part, Monet's work is made. Many of the Impressionist artists, not so much Manet, but Monet, Renoir, Degas, other artists that we'll look at, even to some degree, Cassatt more so, two female Impressionist artists, most of them worked outdoors, or at least sometimes outdoors. And this is a new invention. Previously, when we've talked about artists, say, for instance, Jacob Ruysdael, you'll remember we talked about 17th century Dutch painting, we looked at his images of landscapes. He might have gone out to nature to sketch those landscapes, but he didn't go out to nature to paint them. And that's because an artist couldn't really go out in nature and mix their pigments to paint with outdoors. So Monet and the Impressionists are benefiting from an invention in 1841 of the collapsible metal paint tube. Everybody remember when tubes of paint used to be metal? Probably not. Maybe some still are, but a lot are now plastic. But tubes of metal was collapsible metal tube was only invented in 1841, and with it, pre-mixed pigments. So you could buy oil paint in a tube. That really facilitated artists going out, not having to, again, mix their pigments in a studio, but going out and painting in front of nature. And no one was more prolific at that than Monet. He was very interested in catching the changing effects of the world around him. Not just painting what a sunrise might look like at a particular moment, but telling me what that sunrise looked to him at a particular moment. Right, again, that subjective vision, it's about the artist's vision of that sunrise at that moment. And that is quite significant. It's also kind of interesting to think about the ways in which this painting gave Impressionism its name. So Impression Sunrise was seen in 1874 by a critic by the name of Leroy, L-E-R-O-Y, Leroy. And in response, in one of the dailies of the time, he wrote to the newspapers, he wrote a review of this painting. And he said, basically, he said that Impressionism, or this work, which was all the artists associated with these paintings were called independent artists at the time, not Impressionists. They never took on that term. That's a word we use more today. But he said that Monet should really let his subject sit down before he paints it, and that what we have here isn't a finished work of art, but an impression of a work of art. So a sketch of some sort. So when the term Impressionism was first used, it was very much used as a negative, a kind of negative response to this kind of work. Now at this point you're probably wondering, if this work was so controversial, how did it ever get shown? Because we talked about salons and academies. Most of the artists that we're talking about today were, Monet was an Academy member, Monet was not. So some of them were Academy members, some of them were not. But how did this work get shown to a public if it was so controversial? And so coinciding with the beginnings of modernism in the arts, we have new venues for showing this work to a public. So we have a move away from this stranglehold of the French Academy or other art schools towards new kinds of art exhibitions. So this is where we have the artists associated with Impressionists banded together, got together some money, and set up independent exhibitions. That's how they started calling themselves the Independents. And they had between 1874 and 1886, 8 different independent shows of their work. They didn't all exhibit in all of the shows, but most of them. And I think that's important because the emergence of those new venues for showing art go hand in hand with another kind of emergence, and that is the professionalization of an art dealer. Right, we looked at Vermeer, and some of you mentioned in your midterm that he was an art dealer, right? He hung pictures or paintings in his house, people came in and bought them. But this is where we really have, in relation to kind of the growth of capitalism, a desire for independent art dealers through which an artist or maker could sell their work. And that's really significant because so much of what we've talked about in this course has been where an artist or a designer, somebody has been patronized, right? They've been a patron. I guess that sounds wrong. They've been patronized. I don't think that wasn't right. They might be patronized, but that's a different issue. They had patrons, right? Patrons who supported their work. So all of a sudden now they don't have patrons. They create their work on speculation. Maybe a dealer supports them. And then that work gets put on view in a gallery, or in the case of many of these artists, independent exhibitions. And so we'll talk about that shift over the next few weeks, but just to kind of keep that in mind. Now, we talk about the Impressionists today as a rather cohesive group, but they weren't in their day. Many of them didn't know each other well. They didn't all paint together, although some of them did. We'll look at an example of that a little later. But just kind of keep it in mind, it's pretty loose group that all sort of situate themselves around, again, this new technique and new subject matter at that time. In this particular, I mean, those brushstrokes, like the critic took particular offense to the reflection of the sun itself. Look at I think you can see, even if you're sitting in the back, how thick those brushstrokes are, right? It's impasto paint. It's a thick layer of paint. There's not even an attempt to mix colors or blend them together here. He's just line paint on top of his canvas. Here's one of a series. Monet works in series a lot. This is one of his train stations in Paris in 1877. And here I want to talk about a couple things, but particularly I want to get at this notion of these new sites in Paris. And so, in a sense, Monet might be the Impressionist artist that was most dedicated to the ideas of Impressionism. And particularly, what I mean by that is this interest in the effects of light, the atmospheric conditions of painting in nature. So he would paint the same subject again and again to try to get at understanding it more fully. So we're looking at one painting of a train station here, but he did 11 paintings of this same train station. So just kind of right around the same time period to give you a sense of that. Now, to a large degree, these artists are painting what others, particularly writers at the time, are talking about too. And here I want to get at, I want to introduce a writer, critic, and poet of this period by the name of Charles Baudelaire. And I'll spell his last name for you. Baudelaire. Baudelaire. Baudelaire was a critic and poet in the mid to late 19th century France. He wrote about a lot of these artists. He was a big supporter of the work of Manet. But he wrote in 1863 an article or text that's called The Painter of Modern Life. And this is a particularly important text, in part, in fact we have it on the resources for today's class. It is in part so important because it helped define what is an artist today. What is an artist both as an individual and what is the subject that artists are painting? And Baudelaire argued that artists are just painting modernity. They're painting the modern, right? And he argued it this way. And here I quote from that article and then I'll unpack it. He said, by modernity, I mean the ephemeral, the fugitive, the contingent. I mean the half of art whose other half is the eternal or immutable, unquote. So what's he saying there? Well, there's arguing that by modernity, he means the new, the changing, the transformative, the fleeting. And that which the painter of modern life is doing, or is engaged with, is opposite from the traditional, the eternal, the immutable, which was what more classically trained or academic artists were painting. So Baudelaire was the first to say, wait a minute, this is a cultural seismic shift here, where we have artists doing something totally different than what they were doing before. So I think that that's important to think about. And the other thing that I want to pull out from Baudelaire's ideas is another one of your keywords for today's class. And this is the term flaneur. If you don't have it handy, I'll spell it for you, F-L-A-N-E-U-R, flaneur. The word just basically means, oh sorry, did you want it again? Yes. F-L-A-N-E-U-R. The word basically means a stroller, somebody who strolls or walks, a saunterer, somebody who moves slowly through an urban space or a city. It refers to this act of strolling. But think about it, strolling is not really walking, or it's not walking with purpose, right? Strolling is when you have an afternoon to kill, and you're kind of walking around the seawall or doing whatever with your friends. It's a kind of, again, it's something that is much less purpose-filled or about action per se. This idea of the flaneur was taken up by Charles Baudelaire in another article he wrote around the same time, but it also makes an appearance in The Painter of Modern Life. And he argues that the flaneur is this kind of well-dressed male stroller, or again, somebody who idly walks around the city, who sees the city streets and observes them from a kind of detached perspective. That this person that moves through the city, and again, it's gendered male for Baudelaire and even for the social period of the time, that this figure would move through the city and be able to observe without really being noticed so much. Because they're just kind of moving around the city in a rather idle way. And in a sense, this idea then was taken up by Baudelaire as a metaphor for a painter or for an artist. Right? Because the artist, as a flaneur, is somebody who sees the world around them in a rather unique way. They're familiar with the world. They see it. They move through it. But they move through it not because they're looking for one image or one view or one subject, but because they want to really engage it and respond to it within their work. The flaneur is that kind of artist. It's typically an urban explorer, typically also a man of leisure, right? Somebody who has enough money to be able to afford to do that, to move around that city idly without worrying about work. This is a figure who would be up on current affairs, would know what's happening in the newspaper, would be promenading on the boulevards of the city, would have acute powers of observation to see the world around them, but would always be somewhat aloof or detached from the action, very much an observer. That's the flaneur. And that's the kind of subject position that a lot of the artists that we're talking about in today's class were inhabiting. Manet, Monet to some degree, certainly Renoir and Degas. It's the kind of subject position that they were inhabiting, and we'll think about what that means as we kind of move through. Okay, and certainly with, here we see the smoke of a train station with these steam engines. Again, it's just the way in which it's painted is so distinct, right? No clear representation of where one object may start or stop. The haziness of the smoke becomes a kind of a way to obfuscate the clarity of the image. Brush strokes are interlocking, colors again not blended. That becomes Monet's kind of MO throughout his career. But we're going to look at Caillebotte next, who, we'll begin to see, remember I said it's really a cohesive group, and they're stylistically not all the same. So if this is Monet, here's Caillebotte, another Impressionist artist of the day. And Caillebotte's work is much more traditional in terms of how it's painted, but again, the subject matter is totally modernist. And here I want to talk about maybe some of you guys have seen this painting. It hangs in the Art Institute of Chicago. It's a very large work, larger than what you see here. And it shows us one of the a main thoroughfare or boulevard in Paris. And this is where I want to talk a little bit about how Paris itself was changing in relation to modernity. And so if this is the subject is just a city street, it's a very particular kind of street. And it's also one in which, as you can see, people are mixing. People are, like we see a man and a woman coming towards us on the right, but as we move through the image, you see people are kind of coming together, although there's still that sense of, you can almost imagine the flaneur being in here as well. So let's talk about how this kind of image of Paris becomes visible. And here I'm going to talk about the modernization of the city itself. So I'm going to talk a little bit about urbanism and urban planning. And during the late 19th century, particularly between the period 1850 and 1870, the ruler at the time, Napoleon III, remember Napoleon Bonaparte, not the same one, obviously. This is Napoleon III, names a German engineer by the name of Haussmann, Baron George Haussmann, and I'll spell his name for you, Haussmann. So he engages Baron Haussmann to plan the rebuilding of Paris. And so over a 20-year period, Paris is completely and utterly transformed. And the reason for that is complicated, but stems in part from the social conditions of the city. And Paris is, at this point, a largely medieval city, right? It's been built up over time, very old city, but one which hasn't been planned. It's kind of resulted in a fait accompli based on all this history. That's particularly important to Napoleon III because he comes to power with a coup d'etat. He takes over the government around 1850. And he comes into that position because he's actually able to use that medieval city of Paris to his advantage. He stages all these sorts of small battles in these winding streets that allows him to confuse the guard and to basically undermine the political power of the moment. So he's aware of this medieval street had certain opportunities, but he's also aware of how he doesn't want that kind of Paris when he's ruler. So first thing he does is start this massive plan for remodeling Paris and transforming it into the city that you see here. Wide streets, straight venues, as well as these kind of Second Empire buildings that you see here where everything is the same height. All the buildings are the same height. If you've been to Paris today, you see that same city largely of Baron von Haussmann. Okay, so what did he do? He basically announced a massive public works project to redesign central Paris, which was meant to improve the water, the sewage systems, increase the flow of traffic, straightening out old medieval streets, adding new boulevards. He argued it would be easier to police, easier to prohibit any kind of revolt or revolution. He brought in the first installation of street lighting, which you can see in the center of the image here. So it was about making the city safer. It also allowed for the creation of new kinds of parks and transportation hubs. So the train station that I just showed you, where everybody's English language there, that I just showed you, is one that was built in relation to the modernization of Paris. So just to give you a sense of what happened, during those 20 years period, 1850 to 1870, about 80% of the medieval street system was demolished. Over 85 miles of straight, wide, tree-lined avenues were created. New boulevards were created. 100,000 trees were planted. 4 new bridges were built across the Seine River. 10 were widened and restored. 28,000 houses were demolished, and 102,000 new houses were built. In other words, the city of Paris was transformed into a modern spectacle. This new appearance of the city reflected the ideal image of the bourgeois or middle class, a middle class lifestyle that relied on kind of social order that the middle class approved of. Everything, even new, as I said, the height of the buildings, the facades of the buildings, the actual height of them was determined. So that when you stood in the middle of the street and looked down, the entire street was perspectively proper and ordered. But it all looked like it was ending at a central vanishing point. Would be massive either public work projects or parks. The Paris Opera ends at the Boulevard of the Opera ends right, so you could just imagine that the whole streets were framing that view of the opera itself. At the same time, new parks being built, new, and new, again, places of entertainment. So most of these streets, the idea of the buildings on these streets would have shops, cafes on the lower levels, again, still like contemporary Paris today. And as you move up, it would be all apartments. So that's where people would live in those buildings. So this whole modernization of Paris, we might call it something else today. In fact, we might just call it gentrification. And we've seen it all before, right? I mean, you've lived in an area that's been gentrified, right? Where it gets fixed up, turned on to improve social conditions, it often does. But there's social implications to that. And I want to think about those social implications a little bit. Here I'm going to show you another one of Tybock's books here, just kind of, another kind of big, he likes those perspectival views, but here the perspective is set off onto the left of the image, so not the traditional one-point or linear perspective that we looked at before. And I want to think a little bit about another one of your keywords for today's class. So I'll come back to this idea of gentrification, but first I just want to introduce a word discourse. And I promised you that I would talk about that word after we discussed, I just realized that I'm on slide 13. I think we're 27 slides for today's class, but I'm never gonna make it. So I'm just coming to terms with my own inability to talk faster, which is probably also best. But anyway, let's talk about. We'll come back to ideas of gentrification, but I want to bring up this idea of discourse. And it relates back to the public sphere that I talked about before. I talked about the public sphere being this opportunity to discuss, to freely debate ideas. It's the discourse that's the debate. It's a discourse, again, connects back to this idea of the public sphere, but it denotes written and spoken communication. It's conversation, in a sense. But it's more than just vocabulary or words. It's how those words are uttered. So it's written and spoken communication, but what is the context of those words? How are they uttered? What's the way in which the stringing together of those communications, those words, those speech acts, hold and make meaning in their totality? And we talked about this a little bit when we discussed in our very first or very second lecture, I guess, together on semiotics, sign systems. We talked about the complexity of a word, like how I could say the word dog, and that has an arbitrary sign of a DOG attached to it. But that word dog could mean something very different for me than it means for you when you hear it. Well, discourse is like just ramping that up further. And it's looking at how a conversation or this spoken and written utterances string together and work in relation to one another to make meaning, and the complexity of that meaning. For our purposes, so sometimes we use it to mean that, this kind of generalized concept of conversation or debate. We can also talk about it in relation to kind of field of intellectual inquiry, which is about medical discourse, scientific discourse, etc. But for our purposes, I'm going to put forth a definition of discourse by a post-structuralist thinker by the name of Michel Foucault. Now, I'll spell Foucault's name for you in case you haven't come across him. It's Foucault. For Foucault, discourse is a sequence of signs that function as a statement. It's a kind of abstract construct that allows the signs to assign and communicate meaning, but that meaning is rather complex. And in other words, you can't just pull apart the signs to find its meaning. It needs to be contextualized within its context. So for Foucault, discourse is this kind of conversation as a sequence of signs, but it has a kind of, what is it, as kind of life to it. right? Because it's debated, it's composed of these signs, but these signs are always more than the sum of its parts. That's what I'd say. So for instance, you guys see me up here talking and I say certain words, right? But think about it, when I say them together, like, do you ever think about why I talk so much with my hands? Like, because I'm up here, and I know you guys aren't always watching me, but I'm always, if you're ever in my office, or like, maybe 5 of you come in, or which you know is an option for all, but you know, I talk with my hands a lot. It's because it gives more meaning to it. Or think about the ways in which you're talking to someone, your words can be misinterpreted. Like I was on a small plane yesterday, just really awkward encounter on the plane. Anyway, it doesn't matter why, but I was coming back from Fino, and so I was with my partner, and my partner was sitting down next to this woman, and the plane was not kind of what we're used to flying. I had bench seating, so we had to kind of sit on a bench with a seatbelt. And he said to this woman, may I sit down beside you? And she said yes. And he said something like, well, I would have said no. And he was trying to make fun of himself. He was trying to say something like, well, I wouldn't, that whole notion, like, I wouldn't be a member of a club that would have me as a member, right? Isn't that like a Groucho Marx thing or something? But this notion of like, I wouldn't say, I would have said no to me, right? That I wouldn't like to sit down next to me. But she took it like he would have said no if he asked her to sit down next to him. And so she was like very put out by it. So it was like, oh my God, this is getting off to a really bad start, right? But that's a moment where discourse is, you see how those signs brought together, have different kinds of meanings based on enunciation and context. And so that's what I want to think about in relation to public. Here allows for coming together, a site of debate and discussion, but the discourse within it is where change is happening. It's complex. It's that site of conversation and debate that can be so clearly cleaved apart and a clear stream of what meaning is made and how it actually communicates for change. So we'll think about that as we move through. And we can think about how discourse could be represented in a painting. So we could think about even a discourse between two figures. But really I want to think more about how a painting allows for discourse. How does this work allow for a site of discourse where we're talking about it, debating modernity, debating these kinds of possibilities of the public speech? So really I want to think about how we grapple with meaning as viewers of painting, how we make sense of images. And I'm just going to use this as a way to move back to that notion of gentrification, because I realize I'm going to have to cut this lecture short. So I just want to bear with me for just a couple more slides so I can at least end the thing. Okay, so first we're going to think about the social costs of rebuilding. And then we talk about all this grandness of how Paris is reconstructed. And I'm going to use that the artist Edgar Degas, and here's a painting of this absinthe drinker as a way to think about that. And we know just from her dress, she would have been like a shopkeeper or not a merchant, but a worker, maybe in a millinery shop, a hat shop or something like that. And here we think about the social costs of rebuilding. And so in the whole urbanization or modernization of Paris, 350,000 people were displaced by the rebuilding. Mostly those people were from the lower classes, so the lowest socioeconomic classes. That's a significant part of the total population of Paris at the time, which in 1853 was just a little bit more than 1 million people. So that means 1/3 of the population of Paris was displaced by the rebuilding. Now, by 1872, when the rebuilding was over, the city had grown to a population of about 2 million. So they gained in its size. But that lowest socioeconomic class that had to leave the city could no longer afford to work in the city. So all of a sudden we have the birth of something called the suburb, right? The lower classes moved to the outskirts of the city, and then they need to depend on things like public transportation or train systems to bring them back into the city to work. And so this idea, is of what Paris, that modernization of Paris allowed for. We need to think about the complexity of that. In fact, some social critics, even of the day, believe that Paris was an illusion of modernity. It was a facade, a spectacle, but it hid the reality behind those beautiful facades. It hid the reality that many people were living in slum conditions or moved so far to the outskirts that they no longer could spend time with their families, that this whole notion of a leisure, a workday, no leisure, creates an artificial construction or separation between an individual's ability to lead a kind of holistic or well-balanced life. And one of those critics of the modernization of Paris was a guy by the name of Karl Marx, M-A-R-X, a 19th century German philosopher who was a social and economic theorist, and he was well aware of those tensions between a kind of ideal or utopian belief of a city and the real social conditions that might exist there. He argued that the spectacle of Paris was a screen, and that screen masked a real kind of the disenfranchised or the dispossessed, the alienated individuals in the city. So for Marx, he argued that the Haussmann, what's often called the modernization of Paris, or sometimes even the Haussmannization of Paris after Baron Haussmann, he really argued that modernization is not so clearly good, right? It's good and bad. And here is where I want to bring up your last keyword for today's class. And I know I'm doing it right at the end, but I'll just do that and then come back to this painting and the next one we're done. Marxism comes out of the writings of two figures, Karl Marx and his often writing partner, Friedrich Engels. It's a philosophical worldview or method of societal analysis based on attention to class relations and societal conflict. So when I say class relations, I mean lower, middle, upper class here, right? What are the relationships between different economic classes and also societal conflict? Marxism argues for a materialistic interpretation of historical development. And what I mean by that is, it looks at economics, socio-political inquiry, and it looks at that largely through a development and critique of capitalism as a economic structure. So Karl Marx is long dead, but Marxism is still alive and strong, and argues against late capitalist society and some of the values that are inherent there. Marxism also, so it looks at the development of capitalism and a critique of that as an economic structure, but it also looks at the role of class struggle in relation to economic change. So let's think about that just in relation to these last two images, and then we'll kind of call it quits for today. While this is a new record for me, we've made it to slide 15, I think, or we'll have that until the end. This is the absinthe drinker. Any of you guys know what absinthe is? It's an alcoholic drink that's made from woodworms, right? Or wormwood. It's the worms that go into wood. It's not made from that any longer. Actually, we still have absinthe. But it's not made from that any longer because it caused people to literally go mad. And so in the late 19th century, absinthe was a very popular drink. It was known for its hallucinogenic properties. Very quickly, and this woman here, we know she's drinking absinthe not just from the title, but because of that milky green hue of the drink itself, so the psychedelic. Look at the relationship between her and the kind of lower class man seated beside her. So kind of lower classes and then low middle socioeconomic class being brought together here. And look at her kind of distant stare. There's not a lot of connection between those two figures, right? Or let's think about this image by Degas, another painting about a kind of women on the terrace. These are kind of lower economic class, like shop girls again, or maybe even prostitutes, hard to tell from their dress. But again, kind of speaking of that ideas of alienation of the city or the potential of that. We don't see them having a like hell of a good time here, right? They're slightly different than or somewhat non-connected. And so all the impressionists artists, they got us really the one interested in the kind of the work of the city, the like what happens below the spectacle. And in that way, it's often talked about in relation to Marxism and contextualization of that. Okay, just to conclude, and we're going to have to come back to some of this. So I promised you we'd end with graphic design and we didn't get there, so I'm going to come back to that in our next pass. But I just want to conclude what we've talked about today really briefly by saying that in today's class we talked about modernism as a historical phenomenon. And what I really want you to think about is how it's made from or this really seismic shift in relation to issues of urbanization, technology, and industry. But we've also talked about it in relation to a specific site, and that's the site of Paris. And the way in which Paris itself, through its modernization, creates a new kind of public sphere. If we're ending a little bit in a down note now with the kind of alienation of that city, when we come back to talk about this next class, we're going to think about how does that city create sites for that discourse, for that site, those sites of political and social change, and how might that be useful for artists and cultural producers of the day. But we didn't hear it. So sorry guys. Next class. Sorry to keep it.